was it about this island? Why did it have so much power over the lives of everyone who landed here? What's wrong? She asked. Why do you look so concerned? It's just, I don't know, he said, not meeting her gaze. There's something in that island, something dangerous, and I just got a feeling that we're about to get pulled into it, that maybe we shouldn't be here. I think we have to, she replied. This is our only way back to our old world. But if the island has some sort of curse on it, we might end up with something even worse, or at least I might. He met her eyes now, and she saw the fear in them, but as much as she wanted to reassure him, she couldn't. This whole situation had a dark cloud hanging over it, the same way things seemed to when she and Gulliver had first come to this place, long ago. I think, she said gently, that we've both been in situations before where things went wrong, and we survived. So I believe that whatever is out there will be all right. We can't change what's already happened. She gave him a smile. I have faith in us. She wasn't sure if it was the right thing to say. It might have been better if she told him they'd be fine, no matter what happened. But he looked so relieved at her words that she felt a wave of guilt. She'd just lied to him. He didn't reply. Instead, he looked over his shoulder. We should go, he said. It won't be long until night. She nodded, and they started to walk back down the path toward the beach. Do you really think there's a curse? She asked. Why would you think that? I just get these feelings sometimes that there are bad things out there waiting for me. I thought it was my own imagination at first, but it's getting worse. And when I went back to the boat to fetch you, I saw a bird fall out of the sky. You're not usually the kind of person who believes in omens, she pointed out. No, he admitted, but this time I have to agree with them. She took his hand and squeezed it. I believe you, she said. I'm just not sure why you think it's a curse. They made their way down the path in silence for a while, but she could see his eyes darting around. He kept looking behind him, as if someone were following them. You think we're being watched? She asked. He nodded. There's someone or something out here in the jungle. It feels dark. Not just dark, but evil. They reached the beach, and they stood still and silent, waiting for someone to emerge from the trees and reveal themselves. Do you think it's the island itself? She asked. Or is it just a human that we can't see? I don't know, he replied. Just then, a little head popped out from the trees and a dog appeared. It trotted out from the thick foliage, sniffing the ground, and stopped in front of them. It had long, brown hair and big brown eyes. Its fur was matted and dirty, and it seemed hungry, but otherwise looked like any other stray dog you might see in the streets of London. It panted and stared at them for a moment before running off along the beach and into the jungle. That dog seemed worried, she said. What? He seemed worried, she repeated, but he didn't want to be near us. So you think there's someone else out here? She nodded. Could it be the person who attacked you in the jungle? He asked. She shook her head. I don't think so. It was more like a wild animal, and they don't have dogs with them. He thought for a moment. What about the natives you met earlier? Maybe, she agreed. But if it was one of them, he'd have known we were coming this way, wouldn't he? He nodded. What do you think we should do? She looked up at the cliffs, and as they walked over to the ship, she thought about it. We need to get out of here, she said finally. What? Said a voice behind them, and they both jumped. They turned to see the young pirate from earlier, still standing at the edge of the cliff, watching them with a look of amusement on his face. Where's your boat? She demanded. We need to get off this island. Ah, so you did find my treasure, he said, giving her a wink, and are now thinking of stealing my ship and leaving me stranded here. Well, said Gulliver, you might be stranded here. The pirate laughed. A lot of people are stranded here, he replied. They leave and never come back. They don't understand what's waiting for them. You're talking about the island, she asked. I'm talking about life, he said with a smile. You've only got one life to live, and there's no knowing what's coming next. She remembered how nervous she'd felt when they'd first come to the island, how terrified she'd been that she'd never get home. She'd felt so lost and alone. That's true, she said, thinking about her father and the letter she'd never sent home to him. And now that she was here, she knew she'd never see her mother again, and never get to hear her laugh. And now that Gulliver had come along, too, it made her feel even worse. She looked at him sadly, wondering what would happen when they got home, if they'd ever get home. And he smiled at her and gave her hand a squeeze. He really was a good friend to her. A wonderful friend. But there was a darkness inside him that would never go away. She knew that now. She just hoped they could be together again one day. What do you mean? He asked, following her gaze. What do you see? don't know, she told him. Nothing, really. Just a darkness, like something's there.
Something is there, he said.
There's an evil here, and I know what it wants. You do? He nodded slowly, and it wants us. She looked down at the beach and the ship again, thinking about how they'd left it, and how it would soon be out of sight. She imagined how much trouble they'd have getting it back if they couldn't find a way to leave the island soon. And then she heard a sound like thunder in the distance. What was that? She asked, turning to look up at him. He had that same look on his face he'd had when they'd first arrived on the island, when he'd been standing in front of his father's grave, staring at him through the bars on the iron gate. He was as still as stone and his eyes were distant, like he was looking at something far away from her. But she knew that he wasn't really seeing anything, and when she touched his arm, he snapped out of it, his face clouded by sadness. It's nothing, he said quietly. Just a memory. She could tell he didn't want to talk about it, and she respected that. It wasn't her business. So instead she smiled at him and asked him if he was hungry. But he just shook his head and climbed onto the ship's deck, as if he couldn't bear to be near them. She couldn't help feeling bad for him, though she knew it wasn't her place to offer him comfort. Instead, she stood watching him until he was settled in a ship's cabin and then made her way back to the beach alone. As she climbed down into the sand, she could see that the pirate was still watching them from up on the cliff. She didn't know what he was thinking about, but he seemed to be hiding something from her, as if he had something to do with the storm that was coming their way. But what could it be? What was he planning? She shook her head. It was best not to dwell on what might happen when they left this island. There was no point in worrying about something that might never happen at all. The sound of thunder came again, this time even closer than before, but much louder than the first time, like an explosion. It was followed by a bright flash of lightning, so powerful that she could see it strike the top of the mountain in front of them. Then there was another flash, and another after that, until it seemed as though the sky itself were on fire. It was followed by a sound like the earth itself cracking open, like the end of the world had arrived. And as it happened, she looked up to see that the mountain had split in two. Not just cracked, but opened up wide enough that she could see through the center of it. And she could see something rising up out of the hole in its top. Something huge and black and monstrous. And she could feel a cold chill running through her body as she watched it emerge from the ground and then hover above the island as if it were looking down on them. She ran across the beach, heading for the ship and shouting for Gulliver to wake up. But as she reached the ship's ladder, she stopped in her tracks and looked up in horror as the monster hovered over her for a moment and then suddenly dove toward her, trying to grab her with its claws as it fell from the sky. But just as it was about to reach her, Gulliver grabbed hold of her hand and yanked her away, saving her from being caught by its claws as they hit the sand and rolled over her like a wave. When they finally stopped moving, they lay there for a moment in the sand before getting to their feet again, only to be hit by another wave of wind and rain as it flew down from above. They turned to see that the mountain itself had been torn apart, not just cracked open but blown apart entirely, as if it had been hit by a bomb or a hurricane, and as they looked on in silence, it crumbled to pieces, revealing a hole deep inside it where the creature had been hiding. As she watched, it climbed up out of the hole, looking around at the destruction it had caused before heading back toward the jungle, where it disappeared into the trees once again. What was that? Gulliver asked as she climbed onto the ship's deck. I don't know, she told him. I've never seen anything like it before. He didn't reply as he pulled the ship out of its berth and turned it around to head out to sea again. The wind was still strong enough that they had to work hard to keep it straight, and they couldn't see much more than a few hundred yards ahead of them as they headed out into the bay, hoping that the wind wouldn't get any worse. They sailed along for a while, but just as they rounded the first headland, the wind changed direction, and they were suddenly faced with a huge wall of black water that seemed to stretch out forever. The waves were huge and powerful. They looked as though they could lift up any ship and smash it to pieces against the rocks below. The sky was dark now and full of clouds, so dark that they were completely covered in blackness, and they were struck by lightning again and again and again as they passed through it, each strike causing the wind to blow even stronger. And when they passed through a cloud, they saw that the sea below them was covered in boats, some sailing and others on fire, all of them heading in the same direction as they were. The only thing between them and those boats was a wall of black water that seemed to stretch forever. But it would only take one mistake to end their journey too soon. They sailed on until finally they came across another island, which was much larger than the one they'd first landed on. There were no mountains or cliffs on this island, just a flat plain surrounded by thick jungle that stretched out all around it in every direction. In the distance there were what looked like a handful of small huts made of leaves that seemed to have been built on the beach itself. Gulliver turned the boat toward it, following the shoreline until they found a narrow gap in the trees where they could enter the beach, where they'd find a place to land. He guided the boat carefully into the shallows until they finally reached the edge of the shore, where he gently ran it up on the sand and came to a halt. He stepped down into the boat and climbed back up on deck to help her climb down too, but before he could pull himself over the side, there was a loud splash and a crash of breaking branches behind them as something crashed down from above. They looked up to see that a huge tree had fallen from the top of one of the nearby trees and was now hanging above them on its side, looking like a giant wooden spear about to come crashing down.
Quickly, Gulliver said urgently. Climb over the side.
She hurried to do as he asked, jumping down into the boat and sliding over the side to where she was waiting for him on the beach. The boat was rocking wildly now, and the sound of the waves crashing against the boat's side was making her heart race as she wondered if they were going to capsize at any moment. But then, as if on cue, there was another crash behind them as another tree fell from above and landed right beside them. She glanced back to see that it had landed right in front of the mouth of a cave that was hidden away behind the trees at the end of the beach. It was no bigger than a walk-in closet, and she didn't even know it was there until now. "Come on," Gulliver said, beckoning her over. "We can hide here for now." They ran toward the cave and ducked inside just as another tree came crashing down behind them, smashing into the ground at the mouth of the cave with a deafening crack, showering them both in dirt and rubble as it went. As they stepped inside, they could hear more crashing behind them as trees continued to fall from the sky, crashing against one another as they came down like bombs in a war zone. "We should stay here for now," Gulliver said when the noise had finally died down. "We should," she agreed. She could see that his face was covered in scratches and bruises. It seemed he'd taken the brunt of the impact from hitting his head on the deck of the boat, and she took a moment to run her fingers over his face, gently touching each injury, feeling bad for him even though it wasn't her place to do so. But he just smiled at her. His eyes were still distant, and kissed her on the forehead before moving to check on the boat once more. She took a seat by the entrance to the cave and waited for him to come back to her. It was safe now, she told herself. They'd made it through another storm just fine, and they'd managed to find a new home to rest up in for a while before they decided what to do next. The pirates would be too busy searching for them elsewhere to bother looking for them here. That's what she hoped anyway. But even so, she wanted to make sure they were safe. After all, they still didn't know where they were, or even who they were. So if anything happened while they were resting here, she wanted to be able to fight back if she needed to. And if she needed to fight back, she knew she'd need help.